Xi and Biden and APEC, the good, bad, and the ugly, plus bureaucratic barriers and incentives to smart U.S.-China competition policy. To discuss, I have here with me longtime listener, first-time caller, Matt Turpin, who is a former China NSC Director, currently a fellow at Hoover, and for the past few years has been punching in at Palantir. Matt, welcome to China Talk.
Jordan, thanks so much. I'm so happy to be here.
What's the way to have an optimistic spin on this meeting?
Certainly we should start off by saying that, it is good for the two leaders to meet and to trade views and to be able to have these kinds of interactions. It's a shame that it's taken a year and we're essentially back at the exact same spot. The reality is that this meeting is not that much different than what had happened, 1 year and a day before in Bali at the G20 summit. So that's positive. They need to have those kinds of meetings, and I have no objections to the idea that leaders should meet and talk. Incredibly important. I think another positive aspect is that it appears that we did get some agreement on restricting the flow of precursors of fentanyls, out of China to Mexico, as that scourge is killing tens of thousands of Americans. It's an absolute shame that Beijing uses that as leverage over us and refuses to take sort of basic and sort of fundamental action to stopping drug flows. But it's good that happened. It appears that Senator Schumer's efforts and others were successful in making that clear. So I think that some of those things are good. Where do you want to go next?
Well, let's stay on the sort of meta point. Like, why is it important for leaders to talk to each other?
Well, I think certainly we should be clear that the U.S. and China obviously have a relationship, and we are important powers in the world, and it's important for the two leaders to trade ideas. Now, I think one of my criticisms is that we have over-indexed on Sino-American relations, and we are not placing sort of our relationship with China within the broader context that we actually have broader interests, not only in the region, but in other parts of the world. And unfortunately, I got the impression that sort of last week's summit came across as there's essentially this sort of G2 relationship that's in the offing, which I think is what Beijing would love to portray it as, that fundamentally the United States and China have to come to an agreement to sort of divide up the world. And of course, that's not the U.S. perspective, right? That there are plenty of other countries that have interests here. And really, it is not China's place to sort of have a sphere of influence in which it dictates the rules for its neighborhood, that other powers have equal say. I would have preferred to have seen that we provided just as much pageantry to Prime Minister Kishida and President Moon from South Korea to essentially do an update on the trilateral Camp David summit to essentially demonstrate to Xi Jinping that you're not the only show in town. But unfortunately, it kind of came across that way.
I want to make so Lawrence Friedman, the sort of military historian, strategist, wrote a 50-year kind of like review piece of SALT, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, sort of like ongoing discussions that the U.S. and the Soviet Union had for like 2 decades. And his takeaway was basically this was like in a sort of like military balance of power sense kind of useless, that like very little ended up coming out of it. You were comparing apples to oranges, like the agreements that they ended up making, like did not make World War III from a sort of like balance of military power sense any more or less likely. But just the act of like having a thing where people could talk about stuff was a sort of, atmospherically useful exercise for both sides, which, helped to get folks comfortable with each other and ultimately,
Yeah.
maybe slightly usher in the groundwork for Gorbachev to take the decisions that he did. I think the generous reading of Xi and Biden of Biden pushing for this was that, right? It's like, look,
Yep.
even if we're just talking for talking's sake and like we're not going to come out with really exciting deliverables, talking's better than not talking. Like how much credence do you give to that line of argument, Matt?
Well, I mean, I think it's similar to the old saying by Eisenhower, right? That plans are useless, but planning is everything, right? The process of going through it, the creation of how do you think through interactions with one another and how do you routinize that? But what you actually put on paper may not actually be all that useful, but the process of going through that may be quite useful, because I think fundamentally, our challenges is that breakthroughs that we may desire may not be possible with the current set of leadership, but we could create the conditions where those breakthroughs at some point in time in the future, under different conditions, might manifest themselves, right? And so that's important to continue to go through. But I think that it's critical for us to be very realist in our approach on how these are used. I think it's pretty clear that Beijing views the use of meetings, of dialogue, of communication as leverage in the overall relationship, right? And that they are more than willing to hold meetings hostage to achieve other goals. And given that that's the dynamic, I think we need to be a little bit more hard-nosed about how we approach these. My personal opinion was that and I voiced this before the meeting, that when Xi Jinping started to give, and his assistants started to give sort of inklings that Xi Jinping might not come to San Francisco, our response should have been, that's too bad. I guess we'll just have to go on without you.
Yeah.
And let Beijing have to think through whether or not it wants to be excluded from something. And I think that's the challenge that we're sort of in, is that as we pursue meetings for meeting's sake, we lose out on a lot of other things. And I think we have to be a little bit, so I'm not against diplomacy. I'm against sort of poor diplomacy.
The other argument I find most compelling in favor of the Biden administration pushing for these sorts of dialogues is actually, like, this is a sop to the allies. There's been some reporting around G7 leaders getting like freaked out last fall in the wake of the Pelosi visit and the missile over Taiwan, and the sort of the operating instructions that Biden got were like, look, you got to talk to this guy because we want to, we're going to have a harder time standing with you, America, unless you are sort of like very clearly perceived as the side making the outreach and trying to calm things down. How much sort of credence and weight do you put into that, Matt?
I'm certain that is the message they received. I would have pushed back on them, and had them think through what those threats actually meant. I don't think we should be adjusting our efforts along the lines in which certain allies that have done very little to sort of protect themselves and take these issues very seriously and think it through. I think we should be much more skeptical of their approach on this and essentially say, fundamentally, we kind of know what we're doing, and you need to pay attention a little bit more. I think fundamentally one of the things that we probably need to sort of think through is we need to sort of designate really just sort of one person, right? And that's probably the Secretary of State. Part of the challenge is that as multiple cabinet secretaries sort of rush out to engage with China, it creates divisions. And I think that we would have been much better off had the White House and Secretary Blinken essentially taken the full lead here. And if that meant that we came to an agreement that Xi Jinping would come to San Francisco, great, and have that talk. But I think some of the other things became a little bit serious distractions. And I think we need to be much more sort of blunt with other countries that while we understand that they should be applying that same pressure on Beijing as they are on us. And I doubt very much that those kinds of pressures are being brought on Beijing.
So let's turn to the other headline coming out of the Xi Biden summit, which was the resumption of military dialogues. I feel like this has been something, it's been like an on and off switch for over a decade now. I mean, probably even longer. There was a great clip from Michelle Flournoy, who was on the podcast a few months ago, that I'm just going to play now.
This larger question of risk reduction measures and sort of crisis communications, it really is something we have tried, even when there was a lot of dialogue, back in the Obama administration, where we had this regular tempo of strategic and economic dialogues. And, I used to meet with my PLA counterpart twice a year and so forth. We tried to push the issue then because what things like the hotline, things like incidents at sea agreement, these were mechanisms we put in place in the Cold War with the Soviets, with the understanding that if we have a crisis that's not deliberate or not, intended by at least one side, if it's truly an accident or a miscalculation, we need to have mechanisms for de-escalation and an understanding of how we'll communicate, protocols to de-escalate, and so forth. The Chinese have never been willing to talk about that, even in better times in the relationship. The two things they've said, in my hearing have been, number one, you seem to really, really want this. So if you really, really want this, we will give it to you only if you give it something to us that we really, really want, like stop bothering us about Taiwan or stop talking about human rights. And of course, that's not going to happen. The other thing is I've heard Chinese interlocutors say, look, if we put risk reduction measures in place, that will create an environment where you're incentivized, the United States, are incentivized to adopt riskier behaviors because we have these protocols. So we don't want to do that. And so they just see it through a totally different lens. And so consequently, when the spy balloon incident happened, the U.S. was calling on the supposed hotline for days before anybody answered the phone.
So Matt, you had this in this incredibly diligent Substack you write, which is like very terribly named, chinaarticles.substack.com. You talked about the accidental war fallacy. What are the sort of, assumptions that folks have that mill dialogue is important? And why do you think they're a little off?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think we've had sort of a messy thesis about what the mill-to-mill dialogues are for. I think, a decade ago, when relations between the U.S. and the PRC were sort of, much less hostile, the thesis there is that we could build sort of a professional relationship between our military leaders and their military leaders by sort of going back and forth, and we could sort of inspire professionalism. As that has sort of fallen away, we've increasingly viewed it as a way to manage crisis, and oftentimes I hear the rationale for this as being, that we must avoid an accidental war. And to be clear, I'm not saying that accidents don't happen. Accidents do happen, but wars aren't accidental. Wars are intentional, right? You make decisions about starting and executing a war, but certainly accidents can happen. And if it is a true accident, it actually doesn't result in a war, because both sides do have its own interest not to pursue those things. And so I think we are thinking about military to military relations in a wrong way. Fundamentally, as long as we have, I think for both the United States and for the PRC, relations with each country are managed out of the White House and Zhongnanhai, right? Those are the places where relations between the two countries are managed, and pretending that we can sort of push the relationship and the management of this relationship down to lower levels or to other places, to the Pentagon, to Indo-Pacific Command, right, to a Chinese theater command, and create sort of lower level relationships that would then somehow regulate what the higher level leaders want. It just isn't, it doesn't seem very realistic to me. And we should understand that our military headquarters should be concentrating on interacting with their allies, and making their own plans, and that high level relations are really done at the state to state level, and that's the appropriate way to approach this when you have a really tense relationship. So I think, we've become quite confused on why it is we're pursuing these things, and it's just not all that necessary.
Yeah, I mean, I think the sort of like let's make sure accidents don't happen thing is like, it makes sense if you're like two shipping companies and you're like no one has any interest in stirring shit up.
Yeah.
But that's clearly
it suggests that war is some natural phenomena that just happens out of like it just arises like a storm, as opposed to it's a human endeavor. You make decisions to pursue it. And we may not desire it, but if the other side does desire it, then there will be one, right? I mean, that's I think the problem that we find ourselves in talking about it as accidental.
Or even less, even like not going all the way to war, like talking about the sort of like deconflicting accident thing. I think the most obvious thing that people are thinking about is like a plane crashing into another plane, or like a boat crashing into another boat. And there are, like, ships don't crash into each other unless like someone is trying to send a message or play.
Well, they're playing chicken, right? I mean,
and
so they understand that by creating that threat, creating the risk of those things to happen, they're putting pressure on us to not be there, right? I mean, of course, when you talk to Beijing, their answer is, if you weren't operating here, these accidents wouldn't actually happen because you wouldn't be here. Yeah. And of course, we want to operate there because fundamentally, if we are not there, we've already seen what Beijing will do to its neighbors. They will use aggression and coercion and threats of military force in order to get them to capitulate to what Beijing demands. We're watching this unfold against the Philippines, right, as we speak, right? So that's the challenge. I mean, it just happened to the Australians. It's happened to the Canadians lately. It continues to happen to the Taiwanese and the Japanese, on a nearly continuous basis. So that's the challenge, right? I mean, it is a dangerous situation.
Yeah. Fundamentally, like, there was a policy decision at a very, senior level in China that this sort of behavior was okay. And there is like a risk profile, which the Chinese government and the PLA, I'm sure, understands that, there's like X% chance every year that a Chinese plane is going to bump into an American or Taiwanese plane, or that a Chinese boat is going to bump into an American or Chinese boat. And, people could die from that. And I don't understand how a dial, like, it's clear that, like, no one's happy about this from the US side. And if the Chinese wanted to sort of change their, like, operating instructions such that you go from a, 1% chance of this sort of thing happening to a 0% chance of this sort of thing happening, like, you don't need a dialogue to make that happen. So, okay, so setting that sort of thing aside, I think the other analogy that people think about is, Cuban Missile Crisis, right? That there was some sort of like misunderstanding, like, it's always phrased as like a misunderstanding of intentions. And, there's one thing I think which is sort of different about the Cuban Missile Crisis than today, was like, it was actually not clear how you would get in touch with the other side, right? Because, like, there was not like a ton of digital connection.
The phones didn't necessarily connect.
Yeah. And so you had
that's
all
not
this,
the
like,
problem we have today.
In 1962, you had all this like weird stuff of like, you had like 4 different interlocutors and like 3 letters and like 2 different ambassadors all sort of running around. Like, if the U.S. and China, if there is a crisis and it's sort of unintentional, and one side wants to figure out a way to move forward, like
we know what their email address is.
Yeah, I mean, this was the reporting right around the balloon. It's like the Pentagon was like calling all these numbers, like they know what the numbers are to call. Like the other side just decided not to pick up. So
and we do have communication. I mean, as far as I know, whenever the State Department has asked for the Chinese embassy to come in and receive a démarche, I am not aware of the Chinese embassy ever refusing to receive a démarche or an official communication from the U.S. government. And I don't think we've ever done that either. So we have these things called embassies. Their job is to pass communications back and forth. That's what they're for. So we have this already. It exists. It does work. We may not be happy with the answer
they planned a whole sort of international trip. Like that was a lot of calls. That was a lot of, logistics, right? Like, there's
So we may not be happy that we don't get the response we want, but that doesn't mean there's not communication, right? So it could be that they choose not to respond or to even pick up the phone. Yeah. And I think, so I think you're absolutely right about that comparison to 1962 and the Cuban Missile Crisis. But I would go back a year to 1961 and the crisis around Berlin, in which the U.S. military and the Soviet military were in contact in East Berlin. We ran a 4-part sort of agreement of militaries coming together to be able to talk with one another. So it isn't as if we didn't have communications. And so I think we often confuse the lack of the communications that we want with a lack of communications, right? And there's a variety of different ways to signal, and so it is a clear signal when they don't respond. So we should keep all those things in mind and be. I think we should be less concerned about that. That is not to say that there is no danger. There is absolutely danger and risk, but a hotline doesn't fix those things.
Yeah, I think that's the fundamental thing. Is like at the end of the day, what is going to reduce the chances of conflict? Like I'm pretty sure it's not, 30-somethings and 40-somethings in the PLA and Pentagon. Having Zooms once every 2 weeks talking about, talking
how they don't agree with each other and they have vastly separate understandings of what they want to do. Yeah.
Now, you can also maybe make the case, which I think is probably the most credible one, is like you take the Lawrence Friedman argument. It's like, look, probably better that these people know each other than don't. And insofar as this sort of thing helps to, create those personal relationships, I don't think that can hurt. But
it needs to be at the appropriate level. Yeah.
Yeah. And I want to come back to the accidental war thing in the sort of ally context, because, I take your point that like America should have like more hard talk and like convince the allies that, Matt Turpin's view of the world is correct. But like, if you can't, I still think there's a way to push for this stuff, which doesn't cost you all that much. And, sort of the net gain that you come out on the other side with, having, gained the trust of your allies in the region, is going to is going to put you out ahead, even if it's a little unseemly and you take the meeting with the less important guy or whatever. I don't think this is the sort of the only real downside for me, which I think is a nice transition into the sort of broader arc of U.S.-China policy over the course of the Biden administration, is to what extent you let these types of engagements kind of drive your broader competition policy. And there was a famous Reuters article, which we've talked about a number of times on the podcast, where folks in the State Department basically leaked that they were really frustrated that their leadership in the wake of the balloon was slow rolling a lot of the more sort of, competitive minded, hawkish, export,
realist,
export control, entity listing type stuff, in the hopes of, basically making sure that this meeting in San Francisco. But care to reflect on that, Matt?
I mean, I generally agree. Again, so it is not that I'm saying that, so I'm not saying that leaders shouldn't meet, right? That President Biden shouldn't meet with Xi Jinping. I think the two of them should meet. And I think it is certainly in Beijing's interest to see them meet as well, right? So we have to start from that perspective, that we don't need to be sort of this ardent suitor pursuing Beijing. They need this as well. And we can negotiate sort of much more hard-nosed in how to do this, with the full understanding that we're going to receive a variety of pressure, right? Because it's not obviously just U.S. allies pressuring the United States to do these meetings. There's large portions of the U.S. business community that are pressuring the administration to do these meetings. And I think we need to sort of put into context that pressure does serve Beijing's interests, and we should think through what does that mean for us.
The weirdest stuff, I think it was like Chamath or someone, after she said, "I promise, like, I'm not going to invade Taiwan." They're like, "I heard him, like, let's take him at his word." Really? Like, that's not.
Yeah. Well,
exactly
obviously
how
the
these
Reuters article
work.
from last week. You had a senior U.S. official, essentially, come out anonymously after the summit, that Xi Jinping was quite clear, right, that while he prefers a peaceful solution, right, he can't wait forever, and needs the United States to help him convince Taiwan to capitulate. And to me, that seems pretty clear, that just as Secretary Biden said a little over a year ago at a Stanford set of remarks, that China has transitioned and shifted from really pursuing deterring Taiwanese independence to a strategy and a policy of compelling reunification, aka annexation, right? Like that they have made a shift in how they're approaching this. And I think that we then have to adjust to that change, because I think Secretary Biden is absolutely right. That is the shift that Beijing has made. And they probably made it a couple of years ago, maybe going back as far as the election of President Tsai in 2016.
Let's talk a little bit about the sort of like bureaucratic barriers and enablers to competition. So we had Peter Howell recently on the podcast, kind of gave his view, which in brief,
it was a great episode. Good job, Jordan.
Thank you. Where he, in brief said that there were a few major challenges. So the sort of point one was the sort of relative emphasis that the U.S. government puts on understanding the PLA and its hardware and capabilities and command and control and whatever, compared to like understanding what's happening in the sort of Chinese technology and
missile secret
ecosystem.
Heads. We know a lot about.
Yeah. So, I love this, that like Secretary Gates just said in an interview today, like, "Oh, we totally have a good grip on the Chinese economy." Matt, care to proffer your take on to what extent sort of the information is enough, and how lack of understanding could help or harm U.S. policymaking?
I think Peter was absolutely right in pointing that out as one of the major sort of impediments. I think we should be pretty clear that from an intelligence perspective, our apparatus around intelligence is directed at collecting those things of sort of national security and military importance, right? That's what it's mostly directed at and mostly goes after. And for our economic departments and agencies, they provide much less of a demand signal for the collection of intelligence to serve their purposes. And as the competition with China unfolds, in many ways, in the commercial, economic, and financial space, in ways that it didn't unfold with the Soviet Union, because we have interconnected economic system, that is going to require us to sort of have a much more tactile feel of what those supply chains and value chains look like. What are the commercial relationships between entities? Because that's where the competition is unfolding. And my personal experience is that we don't actually have a very good understanding of what that looks like. And that we are continuously sort of, as we conduct actions like the October 7th export controls of last year, we are having to then go through and discover the infrastructure of all of those industries and everything else as we kind of go along. And that suggests that we're just not well suited or well prepared to collect on those things. And so we need to make, I think, real investments in building that out. And it's going to take a while. And because that knowledge doesn't naturally reside within government. From the United States' perspective, we don't normally see ourselves as intervening in these industries in ways in which Beijing does, right? So Beijing, I think, has a much more tactile understanding because they have an ownership structure in which they own or have partial ownership of large portions of this infrastructure, and have continuously intervened in these things, and therefore have a relatively better understanding of how they fit and work together. And we're going to have to work on that.
Yeah, and I think it's also just like a function of being the rising power from a sort of economic and technological perspective. Like the U.S., I'm sure, like in 1800, knew way more about the UK's, industrial capacity and like milling technology or whatever than the UK cared to learn about the U.S. because like it wasn't important for them to compete, to really understand, what American engineers were doing back in the day, and the sort of what China and every other developing country has had to do in order to sort of compete globally is have a very good understanding of their trading partners in a way in which the sort of takers of the or the people at the very highest rung of the sort of techno-economic global ladder could get away with not really stressing about sort of how all this stuff arrived on their shores.
Yeah, well, and I think and maybe to put it in a different framing, that if our intention is to make sure that this competition does not actually erupt into a conflict in the military domain, and that we want the competition to actually unfold in the economic, the commercial, the technological domain, that's where we want it to unfold. Well, then we need to get much better at what that looks like and how we do that, right? And my fear is that we haven't completely internalized that from a U.S. government perspective, that what that means to compete in that area, right? It certainly means that we should do better, we should do self-strengthening, but it also means that we should take actions to undermine and kneecap our competitor, right? Like I have to, compare that this is not like running a race. It's like a team sport. And in a team sport, you have to score your own goals and prevent the other side from scoring their goals, right? So you've got to do both of those things. And my impression is that we're not sort of fully yet committed, or we haven't really figured out how we're going to pull all the levers and tools in the toolbox of economic statecraft in order to compete in a holistic way.
Yeah, so let's go down to like point number 2 from Peter Harrell. A version of that, and he was sort of less focused on the sort of administration's commitment to the strategic direction of competition, but rather like the sort of processes in place where the USTR needs to sync up with Commerce and Treasury in order to like pursue something in a holistic manner. Let's do the second one first, Peter. What about like the way decisions get made in a U.S. presidential administration work and don't?
So this is where I mean, as I listened to Peter's sort of explanation of this, what struck out to me is that, this problem with process, this idea that coordination between departments and agencies is not working all that well, and they're learning it, and that you've got to continuously sort of go back to deputies and get sort of guidance and all that sort of stuff. That the underlying problem, and Peter didn't say this because I think he was being a bit diplomatic, is that fundamentally the administration has two China policies, and that those two China policies are pulling in different directions. And unless that's resolved, then you're going to continue to have, it's still going to be extremely difficult to make progress and to operate at the speed in which the competition is unfolding. And I would think my one example would be, when the October 7th, 2022 export controls came out on restricting, advanced semiconductors and the tools to manufacture them, it was apparent within weeks, if not months, that there were significant loopholes in that, right? Those are the loopholes that they announced and sought to close just a few weeks ago. And it took them another year to put that together. And I don't think that it was a lack of knowledge or process. It was a lack of consensus on how to move forward. And to me, that's the challenge that the administration has. And that's not a partisan critique. It's the Trump administration had the same problems, right? That there is a division about what the vision is of what you want to achieve. And until an administration can come to a consensus about what that is, it's very difficult to figure out how you're going to implement coherent policy, because every office and assistant secretary and is going to continuously be looking up to figure out what is the direction today, and that's not helpful to being able to sort of execute at speed what you seek to do.
Yeah, and Peter had a little tell, I think, in the conversation where he was like, in the wake of the Ukraine war, all the cabinet secretaries were completely aligned, and we got a whole lot of stuff done. Same with
9/11 and talking about the Treasury Department taking action against banks and getting them to comply, right?
Yeah,
the same. So when there was unity, when there was essentially the political will to bring about consensus, you can move very quickly, right? And I think so. The observation is not that this is a process problem, right? This is a leadership problem, right? You have to make the decision to do it, and then the process can work, right? So we have examples of it working very quickly, and that's, I think, our problem.
So if we sort of continue with your line of reasoning, I think there's a few places you could sort of attribute to being the cause of less than complete sort of unity of purpose. You can start with the deep state, and then you can go up to sort of the cabinet secretaries and the appointed folks. And then you go all the way up to the president of sort of being two minds for whatever reason, which very well may be justified. We were talking a whole lot over the first half hour about a lot of
natural human
trade-offs.
reaction.
There are a lot of different trade-offs involved in all of these policies. So let's start with the Trump administration and then maybe go to the Biden one. Looking at those three buckets, what do you think the sort of how would you break down the cause for the way policy ended up shaking out?
So I think it's clear that it's number two, and then number one, which I think I don't think it's particularly useful to talk about deep state. I think departments and agencies and the offices underneath them look to their own leadership, and when they see that there is sort of division, oftentimes they're wise enough not to essentially act, right? They're going to wait until there is sort of much greater clarity on what it is they're supposed to do, right? And I think that's quite natural. So I think number two is sort of where we sort of sit, and I think it's clear that there are two policies, and I would say the way I would lay it out is when you've got a policy on China that was communicated in the February 2022 Indo-Pacific strategy that the White House put out, in their October 2022 national security strategy, and in the October 2022 national defense strategy. In each of those, they lay out, China is our pacing challenge. It's our principal adversary. It's quote, it's the only country with both the intent to reshape the international system and increasingly the economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to do so, right? And that the administration laid out an objective, right? A strategy and an objective to do this, which is, our objective is not to change the PRC, but to shape the strategic environment in which it operates, building a balance of influence in the world that is maximally favorable to the United States, its allies and partners, and the interests and values we share, right? That's the objective, right? The idea is, like, we're not going to try and change China, but what we're going to try and do is to set up a system that maximally benefits ourselves and our allies, and conversely is disadvantages Beijing. And then, so you've got that laying out as a policy with a number of sort of announced documents and, things that are put out and rolled out. And then you have in April of 2023, the Treasury Secretary laying out an alternative policy, one in which the United States is going to seek to build a mutually constructive economic relationship with China, right? That we're going to take national security and we're going to limit and constrain what it impacts so that we can open up areas of mutual economic importance. And that fundamentally, we're going to shape China. We're going to seek to change China to make it conform to sort of the neoliberal ideals about trade and finance and economic activities, right? Those are just different policies, and they're both being executed, right? So you can see, this came out again in Secretary Yellen's op-ed a week before the APEC summit in the Washington Post. And so these two policies are forcing, everyone else to have to work between the two and figure out, okay, so this week, which one are we following? And that to me is the challenge.
Yeah. So I'm going to make the case for number 3, whatever, the presidents. So, I think it's a tricky thing for a cabinet member or, a civil servant when, we'll take the Trump administration because I think it's the more sort of transparent one, where you go from, trying to kill ZTE one day to taking a call from Xi and saying, oh no, this costs too many American jobs, Chinese jobs, we need to save it, to, putting all these tariffs on and then trying to do this grand bargain and sort of that back and forth, I think for anyone working in that environment is very difficult. And, the sort of the drift that you pointed out with respect to the documents in 2021 and 2022 and the language that we've seen with the, Commerce and Treasury Secretary really coming to the fore with a slightly different, line, I don't think is something that can happen unless you have a president who, is okay with it. So I see where you're coming from, but this is a confusion, which if the president of the United States wanted to clear up, they could have. And it seems tricky to I'm sure all the cabinet secretaries have their sort of institutional and personal views about these topics, which I'm sure are not all the same, but they all work at the pleasure of president. And it seems hard not to assign the ultimate responsibility at that level for a sort of muddled.
I think you're likely right. There is, obviously presidents are responsible for how their cabinets operate and what they come up with. Fundamentally, they're ultimately responsible for the policies that they put in place. I think the way in which the dynamic plays out is that similar to the Trump administration, it's sort of the last person who spoke is the way it goes, right? And so obviously a different president could, execute and insist upon a policy that is more consistent, and then you would get consistency and the message would go down through the system that this is what we're doing now. But it's an interplay here, and I think it's simply. So I would observe that we just don't have a consensus on what the policy is, and that's causing disruptions in the ability to be able to do the things that Peter Harrell described to you last week.
Gotcha. So let's stay on Trump for a bit. We haven't talked all that much about 2025, but we're sitting here Tuesday, November 21st. Nikki Haley's at 15%. I think there's, probably a coin flip that come January 2025, we have another Trump administration. Any sort of thoughts, hopes, fears about what a second Trump administration could do for U.S. policy in Asia?
It's going to be tough for us to gain the kind of consensus that the Biden administration has been able to pull together with other countries on how to approach this. I think particularly for our European partners. Now, I think there is a chance that that a Trump administration could pick up on the kind of relationship that they had with Shinzo Abe in Japan, as well as the relationship that President Trump had with Narendra Modi, to be able to put together an approach with our allies and our partners in the region to continue those things on. I suspect that he would be able to establish a relationship with President Marcos in the Philippines, as well as President Moon in South Korea, and that there would be a way to sort of continue those things underneath the Trump administration. I suspect it will get more difficult with our European allies, particularly as questions around Ukraine and everything else come up. And so it is likely to be difficult. It's not clear to me that it will be an easy sailing.
Yeah. The sort of the other big, well, it's two big questions. First, like, who the hell is going to work for this guy? Your old boss, Matt Pottinger, is probably not super high on the list after having left after January 6th. And the sort of, I guess, like, quality of and like experience level of the folks who are going to be helming the ship on this is something that concerns me. But the other one, which I think is a question that was never really answered, is just how much Trump cares about Taiwan. And, critical to the whole sort of deterrence philosophy, is basically what Biden has been doing, saying the quiet part out loud over the course of administration, is that, yes, the U.S. would come to Taiwan's defense if there was, something as dramatic as a blockade or an invasion. Care to, is it even worth speculating about something like this, Matt?
Well, I think it's critical that any future president not walk back what President Biden has already said out loud. So I think that it's critical that any future administration continue to maintain that level. It's important for us not to be kind of moving back and forth on these things. And now that President Biden has on 4 occasions made it very clear that under the contingency in which China attacks Taiwan, that the United States would intervene militarily, I think it's important to keep that out there so as not to raise ideas within the minds of Chinese leaders that now might be a good time to undertake this kind of conflict. I suspect that when pressed, any president would not want to see really a regional, if not global, conflict erupt in and around Taiwan. And I think we need to be very clear that conflict would be incredibly disruptive to the global economy and would cost thousands, if not far, far more numbers of lives, and the destruction of huge economic potential. So I think all of that I would caution any new administration to take very seriously that our position is to maintain peace and stability in the Western Pacific. Right, that has to be our underlying thing, and the thing that actually does that is our position on deterring that kind of invasion to happen. Because increasingly, as Xi Jinping has made clear, he does want this problem, from his perspective, solved, and that solution for him is annexation, and it is. I think it is very clear that that's not what the Taiwanese people want.
It's a slightly different take, Matt. There are not many people on this planet, I think, who read more news about China than me. And your newsletter is, basically like Bill Bishop levels of diligent, even though I don't think anyone's paying you for this.
No.
What has reading all that news and sort of trying to write a little column every week and process that, like, done to your brain?
First, I'm incredibly impressed with the skill and diligence of journalists in a variety of different media outlets and think tanks, so researchers and think tanks who are devoted to this topic and continuously sort of go after it and find stories and continuously bring things forward. When I started this effort 5 or 6 years ago, and I really just did it internal to the U.S. government and provided essentially articles that's why it's called China articles. And I provided those to our ambassadors and other senior government officials. It was hard to find 30 articles a week on what was going on. I'm now sitting at, I hit 100 and I stop, and I still don't cover it all. And so, and that's every week. And so we've seen bureaus and correspondent offices stood up to look at this. And so I'm really impressed with the quality of journalism that's coming out on this. It is really quite well informed and provides us, I think, a lot of insight in ways that I think we were, if things had gotten more, gotten much more problematic between the two countries 5 or 10 years ago, the American people would not be in as good a position to essentially find information and find out what's going on. They now are in a very good position. Now, obviously, folks have to choose to go find those things, but it's out there, and people are doing great work on it. And so my hat's off to those folks. I'm not gonna give any shout outs to any particular folks, but they knew who they are. They're doing a stupendous job.
And lastly, Matt,
you're included, though. You're in this, Jordan.
Thank you. Lastly, you're a weird book reader. You wanna close with three recommendations of some.
So I just finished, on recommendation from an old Army buddy, Mick Ryan's White Star War. That is essentially, I would term it as essentially the Red Storm Rising of a Taiwan conflict. Looking at a conflict in 2028. I have to be honest, I think it's 100 times better than Admiral Stavridis's 2034. It's so much better than that. So I would recommend that one. I just picked up John Gray's The New Leviathans, sort of looking at what are we looking at after liberalism. I don't know if I fully agree with all of his thoughts of sort of the political philosophy, but it's an interesting read. And then as I look around I'm slowly making my way through Handoff, right? The book that Steve Hadley and others wrote about the transition between the Obama administration, or the George W. Bush administration, and the Obama administration back in 2008, 2009. An interesting read.
Yeah, it's that book's got some very weird vibes, because it just feels like from such a different era of
it really does.
I cannot believe this was 15 years ago.
Yeah. And what's most scary is I remember the period. I was stationed in Iraq, and so I remember the period, but I remember it from a very different perspective. As I'm sitting on a FOB and conducting patrols around southern Iraq.
And you're just one book I want to chat about that we talked about a little while back. That there are a few. Two, International Study as an Academic Enterprise, as well as Foundations for the American Century, which is a history of the Ford Foundation. And, one of the things that we spoke about was this idea of investment in the intellectual capital required to understand the Soviet Union that happened from the sort of government as well as foundations over the course of the late 40s and 50s. Anything you care to add or reflect on that reading you did, Matt?
And I think we've discussed this a little bit, but in order to sort of to prepare ourselves for really the complexities of how this competition will unfold over the coming decades, we really need to have our philanthropic foundations get back into the business of funding foreign policy, national security, and other things. I mean, unfortunately, we've got very few left, the Smith Richardson Foundation and a couple of others. But most of our major philanthropic foundations, essentially after the Cold War, decided that history had ended, right? They read Fukuyama and decided that history had ended and they could move on to other things. And unfortunately, our vacation from history is over, and we don't yet have the processes to build the intellectual capital to do that. Now, that's the pessimistic side. So we go back just a few minutes ago, and so my optimistic side is we've got people that are doing this, and it's all happening. It's happening in different ways, and maybe it's going to materialize in different ways, but it's not as if we don't have good insights into this stuff, and we don't have a robust republic of letters of people discussing these topics and going back and forth. So we should maybe be somewhat optimistic, but I still think we need those large philanthropic foundations to get back in and to encourage people to spend and devote sort of their careers to getting into and really understanding these things from a like a U.S. interest perspective.
Yeah. So I think this is a good time maybe to talk a little bit about the China project, formerly SubChina, whatever issues you have about the political stances of the sort of hosts of their flagship show, Seneca, which doesn't exactly align with the Matt Turpin view of humanity.
It's America. We all have our different opinions.
But I
listen to their stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. The fact of the matter is that it is extraordinarily difficult to build a newsroom and, create and fund a sort of media operation that focuses in the English language on China. And Jeremy Goldkorn, one of the CEOs of the organization, talked about this of basically, and this is a thing that I'm very much subject to, is no Chinese firm will advertise on your platform. And then pretty much any Western firm that has business in China will also not buy advertising on your platform. So you are then left with this very sort of like narrow window of folks who like care about China or are interested in strategic competition, but like don't do any business in the second largest economy on the planet, which just makes for a very difficult operating environment. So, reach out if you want to sponsor China Talk.
It suggests that it just requires different business models, right? I mean, I think David Barboza, and the Wire China, has adopted a different type of business model, right? So it suggests that there is, it requires a thinking and a reexamination of how you would do this.
I guess, but I don't want to be a consultant. Like I've done that for a decade, and like what gets me up every day is sort of informing this broader community of the 50,000 people that now engage with China Talk every week. And, having to spend half of my time informing 5 people who work at a corporation, I think has much less sort of like broader public good type impact than being able to do this show, basically without a paywall for, the broader public, policymakers, students, journalists. And I would much rather be able to find a way to do that with a combination of philanthropic and advertising support than sort of throw up, $50,000 a year retainer type paywalls just to get access to,
I agree with you. I mean, it would be great if what we had is, really our major philanthropic foundations sort of step back in and help do this again, or we have a new generation, right? I mean, we don't have to rely upon the people from the end of the 19th century. We could have a new generation of philanthropic foundations that do this, and obviously, I think there is plenty of interest. Just looking at the way in which newsrooms have set up and have bureaus and reporters reporting on it, clearly there's interest in this. Clearly, there's an audience. And so therefore we could probably get others to step in. It just hasn't materialized yet.
Matt got a song to take us out on.
So I took my car over to get it inspected at the DC inspection station this morning, and was listening to some on the way back because I knew you would ask this question. And I have two. I don't know if you do two, but I have two.
We'll do two. For you, we'll do two.
There's a theme, right? So the first is a bluegrass cover of Pink Floyd's Time, that classic song, right? And it's by Green Sky Bluegrass. And then the other one is Jamiroquai's Virtual Reality from 1996, right? So the theme that I see for these two songs is both have really an uplifting melody, but a melancholy set of lyrics. It's the perfect sort of sweet and sour kind of arrangement for your listeners.
Matt Turpin, happy Thanksgiving. Thank you so much for being a part of China.
And a happy Thanksgiving to you, Jordan.
what we're living in. Let me tell ya. And it's a world that man can eat at all. When things are big that should be small. Who can tell what magic spells we'll be doing for us?